Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Israel marked this week two of the most significant dates on its calendar, its Memorial and Independence Days to celebrate 72 years since its inception and to commemorate more than 23,000 soldiers and civilians who died in wars and terror-related attacks over this period. Yet, this two-day pause in routine activities served to underscore an ongoing political crisis in Jerusalem, which is seemingly about to reach a crucial junction next week. Either a government will be formed or a fourth round of elections in little over than a year will reluctantly take place. To discuss Israel's political situation and the numerous challenges coupled with it, joining us from the southern city of Beersheba is Dr. Jonathan Freeman, a political scientist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome.
Shalom.
Also joining our panel from a community in central Israel is Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisin, who is an Israeli security and intelligence expert at the Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC Herzliya. Welcome.
Shalom.
And here with me in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I would like immediately to dive into our topic today. There is a new emergency government in Jerusalem, at least a signed agreement about formation of a national unity coalition between Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu as well as Blue and White chairperson, who is currently the Israeli Parliament Speaker, Benny Gantz. Tell us more about this situation, the circumstances surrounding this, and the challenges that it faces.
So what did we have this past week? We had the commemoration, we had the coronavirus, and we had the coalition. And the picture is still murky because even though Netanyahu and his arch rival Gantz did manage to sign an agreement, this agreement was open to legal attack as well as being quite politically fragile. And it will only be early next week, a few days before the May 7th deadline passes, that we will know for certain whether the two have managed to pass all the hurdles, both the legal and political ones, and form this government, or whether short of someone else managing to get 61 signatures in the 120-member Knesset and go to the president and say, I can form a government, short of that, we will go for the fourth round of elections in less than a year and a half.
Indeed. Dr. Freeman, I would like to refer the next question to you. To what degree is Israel still embroiled in political deadlock, or have we already passed the first hurdles, considering the fact that an emergency government agreement was signed by both Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz?
Well, I think that this whole agreement that was signed by Benny Gantz and Netanyahu is really an agreement to negotiate for another agreement, because in the end, that entire agreement is more about personal issues and less about policies. Yes, in the agreement, it talks about how they have to fight the coronavirus, they have to fight to unite the country after these elections. But in the end, there's a lot of disagreements that remain to be seen and to be solved. So I think that one of the things we have to look at is whether or not such a government can form with any kind of real policy long-term wise. And number two, and we have to mention that Benny Gantz is really getting weakened because of this situation. And one of the main competitors, which is now facing Gantz, is not going to be Netanyahu. It's going to be Yair Lapid. So even if there is a fourth election, he might not just be facing Netanyahu, he might be facing Yair Lapid. And that could further really strengthen Netanyahu and his ability to form a government just by himself if a fourth election comes about.
Colonel Eisen, your take on this?
It's interesting that I've been waiting to hear the word policy. I just heard it from Dr. Freeman. Aren't we all interested in where we're going? The pandemic is one aspect of our lives, but we live here both in the Middle East, the economic situation before, the other challenges around. I have to tell you honestly, I don't know what this possible government is about. And as such, I think that there are a lot of limitations on it. That's the bad news. But there is a flip side to that. This government, if it does go through next week, will have within it 5 parties that represent over 50% of the Israeli population by far. It will be based on compromise, which from my political understanding is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's supposed to represent a very broad spectrum of opinions, and I see that as a good basis for building any kind of policy here. I just don't know if it's going to happen.
Indeed, this is the essence of democracy, but time will tell. Mr. Oren, I would like to ask you about the regional perspective. The entire region is looking in the direction of Jerusalem to see what will emerge, what will happen the day after a government is formed. This is right now in the process, at least according to the current circumstances surrounding this situation. But what are the people of this region wary of, considering also the animosity towards Israel, especially now at this crucial time?
So there is a relatively broad consensus regarding national security and foreign policy as represented by Netanyahu and the two former chiefs of staff of the IDF, Lieutenant Generals Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, whom Miri Eisin knows very well from their common service. And basically what they are for is the status quo as regards the Gaza Strip and Lebanon, including Hezbollah, and the resistance to whatever Iran is doing in Syria. There are differences of opinion regarding the Iranian nuclear project. When Ashkenazi and then Gantz were in positions of authority in the military, they resisted Netanyahu's efforts to conduct a military operation against Iran on this basis. They were closer to what the Obama administration represented. But this is not right now on the agenda. What is on the agenda is the question of annexation or extending Israel's sovereignty to territories west of its border, not the entire West Bank, but those parts settled by Israelis, including the Jordan Valley. Now, both of them, both Gantz and Netanyahu, came out for annexing the Jordan Valley, but there are nuances there. Netanyahu says that he is going to do it pending an American approval no later than July the 1st. And Gantz says that Israel has to consult with its neighbors, Jordan and Egypt, and make sure that it doesn't worsen its security situation. But this is really secondary. And as Miri said, policy was not the main item in the various campaigns held in Israel over the last year or so. It was personal, it was political. The question of whether Netanyahu, who has been indicted and is about to stand trial for 3 corruption charges, whether he is eligible at all to form a government, and policy is a distant second.
Well, indeed, this was the main point of contention during the election campaign, the first, the second, and the third, for that matter. Nevertheless, when we hear the address of Benny Gantz right after the signature that was made in order to form this emergency government, we heard him say loud and clear, I would never have sat with Prime Minister Netanyahu in a government due to his legal predicament, but at the same time, under the current circumstances of dealing with a global pandemic that impacts not only the entire citizens of Israel, but the entire world for that matter, the situation in Israel is growing dire by the day. There is an ongoing challenge of more than 1.1 million Israelis without jobs. Dr. Freeman, to what degree was that statement by Gantz a certain form of validation that during those days of trouble, of crisis, it is time to put all the other considerations aside and just move forward to a national unity government in order to steer Jerusalem and Israel as a whole out of it?
Well, I think if you look at the facts, the fact is we have a crisis. Even if we open up, as we're now talking about the country again, it doesn't mean that the world is opening up with us. I think that we have a lot of ramifications because of the coronavirus, we have to remember that Israel is a service-based economy. Many of the markets are abroad, not here domestically. Another thing that we have to remember is that of all the people that are not in the government, there is only one individual who is in the opposition who gets all the information that the public doesn't know about, things that maybe are censored, and that's really the head of opposition. We don't have one right now officially, but Benny Gantz has been receiving briefings for the past few months as to the current situation. And we have to remember that the actions that the government is taking vis-a-vis the coronavirus and the fact that Benny Gantz is agreeing to sitting with Netanyahu isn't just about what's happening in Israel. It's really about what's happening abroad, which might be causing us to act in a certain way domestically. So I think what Benny Gantz is showing is, number one, he's aware that the public wants unity more than ever. It doesn't want a fourth election. The public is electing to have a unity government in the face of this crisis. And number two, Benny Gantz knows the sort of things that the government knows, which is causing him to compromise and be able to say he'll sit with Netanyahu.
This pertains, of course, to a lot of classified information regarding the situation in Syria and in Iran and elsewhere. Colonel Eisen, you come from the intelligence world and understand the substance of what is being done behind the closed doors. To what degree do you think that at this stage the challenges Israel is facing right now on a regional scale led Benny Gantz, who was privy to this information already beforehand as the chief of the IDF and had different related activities also as advising the prime minister and other people relating to the security challenges of the Jewish state. Was this what triggered his move into the government?
I don't think so, Jonathan. I think that in this sense, the most important part has been how we face as a country, and in this state, I think in the broad sense, the pandemic and its aftermath. One of the issues is the security issue. But look at some of the other things that have happened domestically that have implications also in our arena. For example, the whole aspect of the Arab vote as it grew and grew and grew. It used to be the third largest party in the Knesset. And then in the aftermath of this new decision of Benny Gantz to go into a unity government, they actually lost that position. I think that the third largest party right now, if I'm not wrong, is actually Yesh Atid or Yair Lapid's old party. So that when Benny Gantz is stepping in, I don't think that he's thinking that the challenge is Iran, that the challenge is the continuation of the war in Syria, that the challenge is the export of terror. No, I think he's looking and saying it's better to be in, to be able to handle the challenge of both the pandemic and its aftermath from the inside than to be in opposition and to bring another election and to bring about the expense of what that means from the outside. And it's interesting that, as you noted before, there are two lieutenant generals, Amir said this before, who are both going to be supposedly, if this happens, foreign minister, defense minister, very important positions. However, we're in a pandemic. Don't you think the most important positions right now are the health minister, the education minister, the finance minister, thinking about the fact that I think right now that perhaps the security establishment is going to have to take a hit so that we'll be able to recover in our economy, in our education, in our health system, so that there is an aspect here of having people who come from the security establishment who I, as a citizen, am more willing for them to make those hard choices that I think are along the road than to not be inside if it was done without them inside.
Indeed.
Jonathan.
Mr. Oren, before I hear your answer on this, I think for every person who indulges himself in studying the situation, both on political levels as well as history for that matter, knows that at times of crisis, true character is always coming forward. This in Israel, unfortunately, also indicated both from the sign of the finance minister, who until the crisis happened was very politically motivated, and suddenly the crisis appeared, and he decided to abdicate his position in the next government, Same goes suddenly now for the health minister, who earlier this week also announced that he had enough from the health ministry and he would like to go into construction, the only sector that hasn't been hit whatsoever by this pandemic. What's going on at the helm when we see that somebody who only is going to lose from this decision to move into a government together with Netanyahu, from his perspective, he's going to lose the backing of a lot of people, has already lost half of his mandates, and suddenly comes to the position of saying, you know what, this crisis is something I have to deal with. This is my motivation to come and serve the people of Israel through unity. It's not the best situation in an optimal point of time, but this is not an optimal situation that we're faced with.
So this is a very gracious interpretation of Benny Gantz's motivation, giving him the benefit of the doubt. Let me pose another possible interpretation. This is not the coronavirus context, but rather the pandemic pretext. Benny Gantz did not really aspire to become prime minister right now. Of course, he put himself up for contention. He was the poster boy of the opposition, but nevertheless, he did not feel self-assured enough to take over the government. What he really wanted to do, and he confided as much with some people, was to become Netanyahu's understudy for the next period, several months, a year, 18 months. Gantz has never served as a cabinet minister. He did not feel confident enough to lead the government, and he used the coronavirus crisis as a pretext to bolt from his own party, his own followers, who are not going to forgive him. They will never vote for him again. It is doubtful whether he will even stand in the next elections, because it doesn't really have a chance to succeed Netanyahu from his position right now. And the very coalition agreement which he signed with Netanyahu is probably going to crumble before our very eyes, because, as was mentioned here, Netanyahu doesn't really need Gantz anymore. Gantz fell out with his former partners led by Yair Lapid. They are not going to support him in any row he may have with Netanyahu. So Netanyahu can now reassess his position and get rid of Gantz altogether.
Dr. Freeman, would you agree with that?
Well, I think it's still open. I think that if we look at the agreement that Benny Gantz signed with Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the first clauses in there says that before we form a government, we're going to legislate all the laws that are necessary in order for the government to be formed. And I could just think in my mind that one of the laws that it could try to bring about is a law to overrule the Supreme Court. Remember, there was such a law that they try to bring about or think about, and they could maybe bring that about in order to make such a government be formed. I think that if the Supreme Court strikes down this agreement, or it doesn't allow Netanyahu to form a government with Benny Gantz, this will even further strengthen Netanyahu, further strengthen his ability if there is a fourth election, both because of that not approval by the Supreme Court and the fact that Yair Lapid is now fighting with Benny Gantz, and even saying himself, Benny Gantz should not be prime minister. He's saying that now, just like he said that Netanyahu should be prime minister. I think that would allow that if there is a fourth election, as Amir said, Netanyahu won't need anyone, because in the end he'll get so much support that he'll be able to form an over 61-seat coalition.
Colonel Eisen, how do you view this?
I think that Blue and White, as a party, when it brought everybody together, was pretty much about being anti-Netanyahu. It actually didn't bring about policies that were very different from Likud. There are very right-wing members that are part of the Blue and White, that they're not now together with Gantz, out to quite left-wing. It's a very differing amount of people inside, similar to Likud. I don't think that Benny Gantz is going to waltz in and take over the Likud. I completely agree that Blue and White, as being on a platform of anti-Netanyahu in its own way, what happened over the last few weeks is that failed. Where does that leave all of those voters? What do they do right now? Overwhelmingly, and I say as an individual, I couldn't vote for a party that its entire platform is being about ousting somebody. You have to have some kind of ideology. You have to have some kind of ideal vision of where you want to go. And I think, and this is to both what Amir said, to what Jonathan said, that Benny Gantz right now has not given a vision. And as such, I personally think that after 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out, in a very American illusion, I don't think he's going to last in Israeli politics.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask you specifically, to what degree do you think that Benny Gantz is actually vying to integrate, together with Gabi Ashkenazi and others, into the Likud in the future, considering the fact that the first person he actually went to and consulted with before entering the political scene was one of Netanyahu's confidants, who happened to be also his neighbor growing up, and they know each other very well. To what degree do you see this process actually pulling him more to the right, more into Netanyahu's bloc, viewing himself, either him or somebody else within that camp of the right-wing Likud party, as the next leader of Israel?
What you are really asking is whether the old line, if you can't beat them, join them, is applicable here. It is not on Benny Gantz's part. Benny Gantz is a spent force in Israeli politics. You did mention his colleague and former superior, Gabi Ashkenazi. He may be more of a viable candidate to join Likud if Netanyahu asks him in, if he promises him the defense portfolio in his next cabinet. But Ashkenazi, too, has lost much of his following by the fact that he joined Gantz in bolting from blue and white.
Even though, when we're talking about Gabi Ashkenazi, the person who was accredited and received the political backing of the Labor Party to start with, also during his time as the Secretary General of the Defense Ministry, later becoming also Chief of Staff under Amir Peretz, who leads now the Labor Party, who is also the person who, together with Benny Gantz, decided to agree to enter this national emergency government. What is at play there?
By the time we get to the next elections, which may be very close, this will be ancient history. Voters will judge Gantz and Ashkenazi by their performance during these particular times, and they are not going to judge them very favorably. But there is one more point. The other protagonist, in addition to Netanyahu here, is the Supreme Court. And what we are having now is not only a political crisis, but a constitutional one, Israel's form of government. And we will see how the Supreme Court emerges from it.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of our guests and analysts the opportunity to provide us with somewhat of an analysis for the near future. Where are we heading to? Dr. Freeman, we'll start with you.
Well, I think that the crisis is really, first off, the corona crisis. I think that it's affecting worldwide. Even if we do defeat for the time being the spread of the virus here in the country, the ramifications are going to continue, and the public expects answers and expects solutions. And you can really see that, according to polls, the public is pretty much trusting the government and how it's handling the situation. And I think that the fact it doesn't want a fourth election, that it wants a unity government, I think is really pushing Benny Gantz to compromise. I think that what we have to see is really who comes about with the upper hand in terms of this crisis, if it continues worldwide, and how the public sees it inside the country. So I think one major place for us to see right now is really how the crisis affects the political situation. Number two, we have to also realize that there's an election season coming up in the United States as well. Donald Trump is coming up for re-election. There's the Trump plan. There's a few other things that are very much on our plate, and this could really much, as they say, clean up the whole table and add a new variable to the situation.
Colonel Eisen, your take on this?
I think that in Israel, in our politics, we need to start looking anew at the way that we define our own security. Look at this right now. We're still, I don't want to say obsessed, but Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, real big challenges out there. But you know what? There's a pandemic. There aren't enough hospital beds. Our kids are not going to schools. 1 million people are unemployed. I think that what may happen in the upcoming future in a unity government will be a different sense of values or sidrei adifuyot, the limit, the way that we look at what our most important aspects are in the state of Israel. In its own way, it's a very odd idea, but I think that this pandemic may change a lot more in Israel than people think.
Priorities indeed, Mr. Oren.
There's some contradiction here. The public, according to polls, may support what the government has done so far. But on the health restrictions side, or movements, social distancing and all of that. But as was mentioned here, there are so many people who are out of work, who have lost their livelihood, and this could come back to bite the government.
And the polls are already indicating that Netanyahu is losing favor because of the economic implications of this crisis.
Indeed. So this begs the question, why would Gantz want to share the blame with Netanyahu when that happens? Because coming out of the pandemic gradually would be considered an achievement by Netanyahu. Gantz would have nothing to do with it. In any event, what could happen is that right now, with all of the problems that Israel is facing, Gantz may join the government on his own. He will not contribute to any real decision-making. And come the elections, we will have a new reshuffling of the cards.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Colonel Eisen, Dr. Freeman, as well as our TV7 analyst here in Jerusalem, Amir Oren, for today's program. And I'd like also to thank our viewers, and we will see you next time.